insecure IoT. My name is Marc Schneider, and I do research on IoT cybersecurity. So, last year I gave a talk about the future of malware on IoT at BSides 2017. And this is sort of a follow-on to that. So I want to just touch a little bit of background about why we need to deal with insecure IoT. And there's lots of reasons why IoT is right now in a state where it's not very secure. But there's a large number of devices being deployed. Some of these devices, like refrigerators, you hope are going to last 10 years or more. But if you think about like the cell phone in your pocket, even if you have a fancy $1,000 cell phone, the likelihood that it's going to be supported in 2 years is small. Typical support contracts for the OS on smartphones is 18 months. So after 18 months, there's no guarantee that you'll be able to put patches onto your phone. Most of the time, they do support it for longer, but the older your device is, the less likely there are going to be patches. What if that's your 10-year-old refrigerator? Okay, so even if things were perfectly secure today, does anybody think in 10 years with no patches it's still going to be secure? Probably not. In enterprise networks, there's a number of things you can do to mitigate this. You can put firewalls in place, intrusion detection, intrusion prevention. You can have host-based IDS systems. There's lots of different tools you can apply to different points in the network and be able to restrict traffic flows and whatnot. Well, in IoT, in particular consumer IoT, which is the area I focus on most, is that's not going to work. No one, except probably some people in this crowd, is going to start putting lots of defensive measures on their home network. You just want to plug in the device and it's going to work. As I'll talk about in a little bit, like even doing much more than pressing a button is sort of a large security hurdle to get over when people are setting up their devices. So what is the issue really here? So the problem is not the problem. What do I mean by that? The problem, whatever specific problems devices have, the vulnerabilities, the different network services that may need to be shut down, etc. That's not the problem. The problem is that these devices have the ability to affect a larger system. In the case of consumer IoTs and a connected smart home, it's all your different IoT devices and maybe your computers and your phones when they join the network and all sorts of different stuff that you're connecting together without really thinking about what are the security implications of that. You're doing that because it's your house and you don't want to do your job all the time at home and at work. Or if you're 99% of the rest of the country, you don't have the skill set to put in that defensive measures. So what are we going to do about that? To understand what we're going to do about that, we have to look at what's called the risk equation. And I put some equations in here so that it can be cited for your PhD thesis. Feel free to go ahead and cite this. The equations that I'm going to have here are basically this simple. What is risk? Risk is the probability of an event times the cost if that event occurs. And then you take that for all the possible events, add them all up, and that's the risk associated with that. Classic example is nuclear war. Very small probability it's ever going to occur. Very high cost if it does occur. What's the risk associated with that? It's the probability of the event times the cost. Okay? So I'm going to keep referring back to this idea of the risk equation. And this is what I mean when I say risk equation. So what happens when a device gets compromised? Well, first of all, let's look at trying to prevent the device from getting compromised. So you're putting firewalls in place, you're putting intrusion protection systems, all these other defensive measures. For the most part, what they're doing is focusing on the probability of an event occurring. Okay, so your IoT device has an open telnet port with a hard-coded password, and you put a firewall in place to stop that attack vector. You are reducing the probability that that attack is going to be used. Okay, so you reduce your risk. However, as we get more devices, as we add more devices to our networks, that probability, when you look at all the events that are possible, first of all, won't ever go to zero. And it's really increasing rather than decreasing. When you start adding these IoT devices, even if they're relatively secure for IoT devices, there's the problem of it's never going to be zero. And there's lots of devices, and all those different possible events get added together, and you have a large attack surface, which means high risk. So what happens when the device does get compromised? How do we deal with this problem of risk? Well, the risk equation has two parts to it. It has the probability that something's going to happen, and it has the cost of the consequences of that happening. So instead of only trying to reduce the probability, what if we look at reducing the cost? It's logical. You're multiplying two things together, you make either one small, the total goes down. I'm assuming everybody knows how to multiply. Otherwise, I wonder what you're doing at this conference. In any case, so we look at all the events that occur. You can still have your firewalls and intrusion protection, so you're reducing the probability. But when you start reducing the costs as well, you have a significantly lower risk. Your total risk is coming down. So what happens when a device gets compromised? Well, I'm talking about compromise here. You have root level access on this device. You own the device. You can do whatever you want with this device. The probability of any event occurring on that device is now 1. You can reprogram the device to do whatever you want. You want it to make outbound telnet connections, you can make it do that. So if you think of all the possible things that can be done with that device and add it up, that's the risk associated with a compromised device. That's why you don't want to have compromised devices on your network. They can either directly have effects, like we saw with Mirai, where compromised cameras were used to attack the internet infrastructure, or they can be used for pivot points to gain access to other nodes in a network that might not be available, etc. So this is for one device. But what does that mean about the risk of the whole system? So what we do to figure that out is we added up all the devices. Okay, so it's the probability of an event on one device times the cost of that event over all your devices and all the events that can occur on those devices. So instead of trying to, or relying on stopping these things, let's focus on the outcome. What do we really want to do? We want to make sure that your smart speaker embedded into your shower head, so you can listen to the tunes in the morning, is not going to make your refrigerator misbehave and cause all your food to go bad. Or, if it's an enterprise example or some other thing, whatever, thermostat, let's say you have a smart thermostat, you want to make sure it doesn't bring down your production line in your manufacturing place. Okay? That's the goal, because you know that you're never going to prevent everything. So you want to make everything less harmful. Here, there's some more math if you're really interested. All it really says is that you want to make these things independent. Okay? So if an event happens on one device, it doesn't reduce it doesn't increase, I'm sorry, the likelihood of an event on another device. Simple as that. It's just a mathy way of saying that. So we do this by isolating the effects of the compromise. We can do this by isolating the devices. So again, we're talking about consumer Internet of Things. Probably everybody here has seen a VCR. Probably everyone here has seen a VCR blinking 12. Why? Because pushing 2 buttons at one time to set the time is too complicated for the value that you get out of setting the time. Okay? Are people familiar with WPS on access points and devices? Why was this added? Because typing in a password twice was apparently too hard for a lot of people. So they wanted to be able to push buttons and have the devices simply connect up. Okay? Maybe in the fancy implementations you type in a PIN that's fixed for all of that device class. But the thing is, these were the types of security controls, the security support that was put on consumer-level devices. So you can't expect your consumers are going to do anything much more complicated than push a button. One of the approaches to automatically isolating is to use a protocol that's being developed by the IETF called MUD. And it's the manufacturer's usage description. And basically what it says is it's a way of communicating what the expected behavior of a device on a network is. Okay? So if I have my smart light bulb and it's supposed to be talking to 2 addresses in the cloud, it should only be able to talk to those 2 addresses. If, I see my light bulb transmitting 10 megabit files for 15, 20 seconds, there's probably something wrong with my light bulb. So you can do traffic shaping and limit the amount of traffic in these devices. You go to a typical consumer, tell them all this, they're going to look at you with a blank face. So it's automatic. What happens is a MUD-capable router access point would automatically configure itself to limit your smart light bulb to acting like a smart light bulb and nothing else. But what about on the local network? It's great that you can't go and take down a DNS provider because your device got compromised, and so did 500,000 other people's devices. But what if it starts moving around in your network and spreading malware or giving people access to install keyloggers or screen scrapers on your computers to get your bank account information so they can drain it? That would be a high cost in this device. So a lot of access points have a guest feature where you don't have to give out your regular password. You can have a guest password, and that guest password allows them to access the internet, but not your internal network.
Dr. Schneider, one of the things that I heard about for people is that we assume that they can plug in a router into their Comcast or their AT&T. If we assume they can plug in one, we assume they can plug in 2. And so it's called the 3 dumb routers. And you have your dirty network, which you can put all your light bulbs and your refrigerator on. And you put your computer that actually has your financial data and all that on another network, and you put them on completely different subnets so they can never talk to each other. Is that simple enough, or is that even too hard for people to plug in 3 dumb?
That's too hard, and people are going to say, why do I have to have 3 routers in order to listen to my streaming music in my shower?
They'll ask you why you have 3 internets.
Yeah. Which internet should I use? Did I send one of the internets?
Verizon would charge you for all 3 too.
Yeah. So, you know.
No, it's you basically plug 2 dumb routers into your Verizon, which is a dumb router.
And, you know, for people that know what they're doing, you can set up something like that.
Okay.
For, you know, your grandfather out, you know, in Florida or Midwest somewhere that calls you up every time they want to send you an email to ask how to do it again, they're never going to do that. So, as I was mentioning, they have these guest features. And some of the guest features also isolate each device from each other. So you have 2 guest devices, a phone, one person's phone, another person's phone. They're both on your guest network. They can't talk to each other without going through the internet. So if we start putting features like these inside of the routers, then each device gets its own isolated connection automatically. So your shower head can talk to the internet, and your fridge can talk to the internet. But if they want to talk to each other, they're going through the internet. Questions?
So, you're saying if we went back to your risk equation, right? So, we know that events are going to happen. It's the cost, right?
It's the cost. So we're reducing the harm of a compromised device. The compromised shower head can't talk to the refrigerator. So therefore, it can't cause the refrigerator to misbehave, at least not without going back to the internet, which is effectively the risk you already have by putting your refrigerator on the internet. Yes?
So I know some IoT devices will have smartphone apps associated with them that talk over the Wi-Fi. A lot of those can multicast at work, given the fact that all devices that are isolated, that function would break. Everything would be talked to the internet back in to function.
So
it's sort of a trade-off.
Yeah, so there are some devices that are configured that way. There are other devices that do go to the cloud every time you use a smartphone. For the cases that do need that local access, this is again maybe a future version of something MUD-like, and that's why I also say guest-like. It would have the manufacturer's information associated with that device that, oh, we need this multicast address available on the local network for this phase. So maybe once it learns the devices, it can shut that down for that device. It's going to depend upon what the manufacturer needs to be able to do. Yes?
Yeah, so I'm definitely interested in your thoughts on this. So regarding so WPS, for example, and even like UPnP, when we think of like IoT devices, we think of things that are insecure, and I think that all boils down to the manufacturer. Yeah, the manufacturer basically designing systems that are meant to be simplified, because we do sort of by default, like we make the joke about users being, it's a layer 8 issue, it's the user's fault, they're stupid, things like that.
Yep.
But really, when you actually think about technological implementations, like we're oversimplifying things, and then thus there are vulnerabilities coming out of those things. So we're sort of training the user to do things that I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Right. So that is one thought. You want to make it very simple. There's also, from the manufacturer's perspective, support. You make it too complicated to do, you're going to get more support calls. It's going to raise the costs associated with it.
Sure.
Okay. IoT, especially as it exists right now, is all about keeping device costs low, because everybody's trying to get in on it. And if you give the same features as a competing thing, but you charge $15 more, and there's no advantage, they're going to go with the cheaper device. So all these manufacturers are competing on features that the users can see and that the users want, like the ability to listen to music out of your shower head, and not putting the time into hardening the OS that they're using in your shower head.
Consumers don't know that they need security.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing. Well, why is it insecure? You sold it to me. Why should you sell me an insecure product?
But do you think that's more so? And sorry, I was just gonna say, like, do you think that's an education thing that needs to happen amongst users, and
It's an education
it seems
thing
like,
that needs to happen, but unfortunately, I think the horse is already out of the barn. People have been conditioned to expect crashes on, well, it's getting better, but, you know, conditioned by the history of the IT industry to expect certain things, okay? They continue to expect that. You know, you go and look at the way systems were built 50 years ago. They were very different than the way they're built today. You know, it was typical back then, you gave the source code to your OS, to customers, because you were selling the hardware, not the OS. Well, now when companies are selling OSs, they're not giving them away for free because that's their product. So they're not giving you out the source code for it. You know, that doesn't matter whether it's OS or other things, but, you know, so you get open source software movement rising up. Don't want to go into a history of where some of these problems came from, but right now the biggest issue is people want functionality and they want it cheap, and there's low barrier to market entry.
Like you said, it's a race to the bottom, essentially, in terms of cost.
Right.
I mean, we saw Google Home Minis go on sale for like $30. So now if anyone sells any device that's more than $30, $40, $50, people are going to ask, well, why should I buy that?
Yep.
If it comes from a company like Google or Amazon, then they're not going to question whether it's secure. They're just going to assume it's secure.
Yeah. And
I'm not saying it always does, but
exactly. They're going to trust the brand.
Yeah.
It may just be that that company bought a smaller company because they liked their product and wanted to get into that space. It still may not be, the same quality as some of their other products that have been more maturely developed.
I deal with people that's very complicated because people don't care. They say, well, it's secure, it's cheap, it does what I want, I don't care, I have nothing to lose. And then if you go to the web and see what people put on the web, it's telling you the privacy and things that people put. It's not really something people care about. So you can't change people. It's very hard to change this problem. It's either regulation, government says, whoever does best, we're going to find a lot, or we have to live with this.
Right, so generally industry doesn't like to be regulated. What frequently will happen is when companies see this regulation coming, they'll band together and have raised the bar so that this is where things like manufacturer's usage description becomes important, because companies now have a way to do this.
Mark, I know you're focusing on internally, like IoT inside a house, but for my job, I'm more concerned about my customers being DDoSed by those devices internally. We have Mirai examples, variations of Mirai. That router that you mentioned before, that functionality, is it envisioned that it would also detect potential DDoS attacks coming out of the network and block that?
So MUD is an example of a technology that would be really helpful preventing IoT devices from being used in a DDoS attack.
Two-part, one, can you comment on some of the mesh routing systems that supposedly have an IoT IDS built in? If you've heard about and then the second one is, what do you think about NTIA and FTC's efforts about sort of regulating IoT patching?
So I'm not going to speak for the government. I don't want to talk about what they're going to do. In terms of mesh networking built-in IDSs, the question you have to ask yourself is that going to be reflected in the cost? And then if they're competing on cost and features, and people can't see that, people generally don't care that, oh, my IoT device uses mesh network. No, they care that it plays music in their shower and that it's cheap. So, you know, the question is, what good is that IDS going to do? Is it going to raise the cost and so manufacturers stop using that feature? Is it truly an IDS, or do they want to give people a good feeling so they say IDS? What is that system doing? So unless we're looking at a particular system, I can't really answer the question.